The conference room at the Wolfschanze in East Prussia was stifling in the July heat of 1942, made worse by the presence of a dozen senior officers crowded around the map table where Adolf Hitler stood, his finger tracing routes across the southern Soviet Union. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl flanked him, while Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group South, had been summoned from the front to receive new directives that would fundamentally alter the course of the war. Hitler had been studying maps and production reports for weeks, wrestling with the strategic decision that would determine Germany's approach to the 1942 summer campaign. The previous year's drive on Moscow had failed in the winter snows, leaving German forces exhausted and overextended. Now, with spring having allowed regrouping and reinforcement, the question was where to strike next. The obvious target was Moscow, the Soviet capital and transportation hub, whose capture might decapitate Soviet resistance. But Hitler had concluded that the obvious course was the wrong one. The Führer began to speak, his voice intense as he outlined his reasoning. Moscow was not the key to defeating the Soviet Union. He insisted the Bolshevik state was not like Western democracies, where the capture of the capital meant political collapse. Stalin's regime was totalitarian, capable of continuing resistance from Siberia if necessary. The Red Army could retreat beyond the Urals and continue fighting indefinitely using industrial capacity that German forces could never reach. What Germany needed, Hitler continued, was not symbolic victories, but economic resources. The Soviet Union's ability to continue the war depended on oil from the Caucasus, on grain from Ukraine, and on industrial production in the Don River basin. If Germany could seize these resources while denying them to the Soviets, the economic foundations of Soviet resistance would crumble. The Red Army, deprived of fuel and industrial capacity, would be unable to sustain operations regardless of how much territory it still controlled. Hitler had spent considerable time studying economic intelligence reports that detailed Soviet production and resource dependencies. These reports, compiled by economic warfare specialists, painted a picture of Soviet vulnerability that seemed to validate his strategic instincts. Soviet oil production was concentrated in a few key fields, with Baku in the Caucasus producing over 70% of total output. Soviet tank and aircraft production required this oil to function. Soviet agriculture in critical regions depended on mechanized equipment that required fuel to operate. The Führer's analysis went beyond simple resource acquisition. He envisioned a strategic paralysis that would spread through the Soviet war machine once oil supplies were interrupted. Tank armies would be immobilized, air forces would be grounded, industrial production would slow as factories lacked fuel for transportation and power generation. The vast Soviet military, impressive in numbers but dependent on continuous resupply, would gradually lose its operational capability. Moreover, Hitler saw the Southern offensive as achieving multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. Capturing the Caucasus would provide Germany with secure oil supplies while denying them to the Soviets. Control of the Don and Volga river basins would secure vast agricultural regions. Occupying Stalingrad would sever north-south communications and eliminate a major industrial center. All of these objectives contributed to weakening Soviet military capacity in ways that capturing Moscow, however symbolically important, would not. Hitler's finger moved to Stalingrad on the map, tracing the Volga River that flowed past the city. Stalingrad was the key to the entire southern strategy. He explained the city was a major industrial center, producing tanks, artillery, and other weapons. It was a crucial transportation hub where railways from the Caucasus met the Volga River, which carried oil northward from Baku. If Stalingrad fell, the connection between the Caucasus oil fields and central Russia would be severed. Soviet industrial production would be crippled by fuel shortages, while German forces gained access to the oil needed to sustain mobile operations. Moreover, Stalin bore Stalin's name. Its capture would have psychological impact beyond its economic and strategic value. Stalin would be forced to commit massive forces to defend a city named after him, allowing German forces to destroy Soviet armies in battle, rather than allowing them to retreat into the vastness of Russia, as they had in 1941. Von Bock, who commanded the forces that would conduct the offensive, listened with growing concern. He understood Hitler's economic reasoning, but questioned the operational feasibility of what was being proposed. The distances involved were enormous. From current German positions to Stalingrad was over 400 kilometers across open steppe. The Caucasus oil fields were even further. German supply lines would be stretched thin, vulnerable to Soviet counterattack. And dividing forces between the Caucasus and Stalingrad created the risk that neither objective would be achieved. The field marshal had commanded armies in Poland, France, and the initial drives into the Soviet Union. He understood mobile warfare and the requirements for sustaining rapid advances. The southern offensive that Hitler was proposing would operate at distances and across terrain that strained German logistical capabilities to their limits. Railway lines in southern Russia were less developed than in other regions. Roads were primitive, turning to mud in rain. Supplies would have to be trucked hundreds of kilometers from railheads, consuming fuel that was needed for combat operations.
Moreover, von Bock recognized that the division of forces between multiple objectives violated fundamental principles of concentration of force. German military doctrine emphasized massing strength at decisive points, achieving overwhelming local superiority that could break through enemy defenses and exploit into operational depth. But Hitler's plan dispersed German strength across a front hundreds of kilometers wide, with major drives toward both the Caucasus and Stalingrad, neither receiving the concentrated force needed to guarantee success. The field marshal also worried about the quality of forces being assigned to flank security. The Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies were allies in name, but were poorly equipped compared to German forces. They lacked adequate anti-tank weapons, had insufficient artillery, and were led by officers whose training emphasized defensive doctrine from the previous war. Asking these forces to hold extended frontages against potential Soviet counterattacks was asking them to do something they were not equipped or trained to accomplish. Von Bock attempted to raise these concerns, suggesting that a concentrated drive on Moscow might achieve decisive results more reliably than the dispersed southern strategy. Moscow was closer to current German positions, could be approached through better terrain, and remained the Soviet Union's nerve center regardless of the regime's totalitarian character. Its capture would disrupt Soviet command and control, sever railway connections, and might even trigger the political collapse that Hitler dismissed as impossible. But Hitler rejected this argument with growing irritation. The Wehrmacht had already tried to capture Moscow and had failed. Soviet defenses around the capital were formidable, reinforced over the winter, while German forces had been pushed back. Another offensive toward Moscow would face prepared positions, would bog down in attritional fighting, and would consume German strength without achieving decisive results. The southern offensive, by contrast, would attack into areas where Soviet defenses were weaker. The terrain favored mobile operations, open steppe where panzer divisions could maneuver, and where the tactical superiority of German armor and combined arms tactics could be exploited. The weather would be favorable throughout the summer and into early autumn, avoiding the mud and snow that had plagued the 1941 campaign. Hitler became more animated as he developed his argument, pacing around the map table, gesticulating to emphasize points. He spoke about oil as the bloodline of modern mechanized warfare. Without adequate fuel, tanks could not advance, aircraft could not fly, trucks could not transport supplies. Germany's own oil situation was precarious, dependent on Romanian production and synthetic fuel plants that could not meet military requirements. Capturing the Caucasus oil fields would transform Germany's strategic position, providing fuel security while denying it to the Soviets. Jodl supported Hitler's analysis, noting that German intelligence estimated Soviet oil production at millions of tons annually, most of it from the Baku fields in the Caucasus. If this production could be captured or even just denied to the Soviets, the Red Army's operational capability would decline dramatically. Soviet tanks would be immobilized for lack of fuel. Soviet aircraft would be grounded. The industrial war machine that Stalin had built would grind to a halt.